Hello everyone. In these videos, I am going to go over chapter 11, where we're going to talk about personality. And in fact, I'm going to talk about different fields of psychology and how they view personality, how they measure it, and how they think that it comes to be. So, of course, I'm going to start with Freud, which is psychoanalysis. Freud, you might remember, trained to be a medical doctor who focused on the brain. But what happens is when you study the brain, it doesn't really give you insight into how people are acting or why people are acting that way. And especially in the early 1900s, where Freud was conducting research and had patients that came to him, knowing everything there was to know about the brain just really wasn't enough to understand what was happening in the mind. And so Freud goes into essentially all of the centuries where psychology was studied as a philosophy. And he kind of pulled out important stuff from the philosophies, kind of mixed it in with what he understood about the brain and development. And he came up with a few theories that explain the mind, how it works. And I'm going to talk about just a handful of these that relate to personality. Now, you'll notice next to Freud, there is a picture of an iceberg. That is because we often use a picture of an iceberg to describe the mind according to psychoanalysis. Because according to psychoanalysis, there is a portion of your mind that is conscious, that is aware. For example, you're aware of who your parents are. You're aware of how you feel as you're listening to this video, maybe bored. But there's a lot of things that you aren't aware of. There's a lot of analysis your brain is doing for which you are not aware. Some of them are real obvious, right? You don't know, you're not aware of how your brain is making your heart beat. But of course, there are other things that are unconscious, and more specifically, you have thoughts, feelings, and ideas that are unconscious. They're part of your mind, but you do not know that they're there. And we talk about the unconscious mind at that point. Now, you'll notice that in the middle there's something called the pre-conscious. The pre-conscious are things that you're not really aware of all the time, but sometimes if you think about it, you can kind of come up with that information. So, for example, let's say you're really angry with your friend, and at first you think is that she didn't show up to the party. Okay, just an example. But the more you think about it, the more it dawns on you that your friend was kind of rude to you yesterday. And it dawns on you that maybe that's the reason why you're actually upset with her. That is something that might be in the pre-conscious. It it's kind of there. You have access to it, but not really most of the time. Now you'll notice that there are a couple of lines being described in that picture. One of them is called the ego, the other one is called the superego, and the third one is called the id. You'll notice that your id is almost entirely in your unconscious mind. You are not aware of the things your id wants you to do and feel. This includes sexual aggression, feelings of violence, and a bunch of fears and ideas that you really don't want access to because they're gross or vile or aggressive or violent. Now, you'll also notice that your superego runs the gamut. A chunk of it is in your unconscious mind, part of it is in your preconscious, and some of it is in your conscious mind. Again, that's because when you think about what is right and how you expect the world to be and how you expect to fit into the world, where, well, you are aware of that a little bit. And there's some stuff that's kind of in the middle. sometimes you have to think about it. Otherwise, you don't really know it's there. Maybe if I ask you, why do you believe that murder is wrong? Well, parts of you are going to come up with really logical answers that are in your awareness, but some things might just be kind of under the surface. Maybe a movie you saw when you were young where someone died and it really affected you, or someone who died when you were young and it really affected you negatively. And you don't always think about it. It's there and you have access to it, but you don't always think about it. But if you force yourself every once in a while, you'll go, oh, yeah, and then one time I saw this thing, or a family member passed away and it really messed me up. And so, I always think about that when I think about murder. But there are other things in your superego that are unconscious, that you're not aware of at all. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about these in general. Now, I'm going to talk about the ego and the superego by painting an image of essentially a meme that you've probably seen in society. A little devil on your shoulder or a little angel on your shoulder, right? That little devil on your shoulder, that's your id. It's the most animalistic part of your personality. If you think back to chapter 2, this is going to be your amygdalas, your limbic system. It wants you to eat. It wants you to survive. It wants you to be aggressive. It wants you to be sexual. Your id is always wanting you to do the thing that gives you immediate gratification. In this case, you see the girl there thinking that she should probably cheat on this test. That's your id telling you to do that. Just go ahead and cheat. It is your more animalistic self. Now, on the other side, you have your little angel, and your little angel is going to be your super ego. Your super ego is telling you what society thinks is right or wrong. And as I mentioned earlier, it's kind of rude about it. It makes you feel guilty, it makes you feel ashamed in order to get that to happen. And I'm going to talk about in a different video that the way you develop your super ego is by internalizing your parents. And there you have all those moms and dads from TV there, because we internalize our parents as our super ego. Your super ego tells you what is right and wrong. And so your super ego is going to tell you, you should not cheat. It's bad. It'll make you feel bad about it. It means you're a cheater, your super ego will say. It means that you're dumb and you can't get anything done. Your super ego is kind of aggressive. It makes you feel really bad. And there in the middle, you see the referee. And the referee should be refereeing between your little devil, your id, and the little angel, your super ego. Your ego then has to make a decision. It is your ego who decides who's right, your id, your super ego, or maybe just something more realistic, because the ego takes into account realism, the world in which it lives. Now, your id does not understand reality. It does not care that you can't do something physically. It doesn't care that someone is bigger than you. It doesn't care that society doesn't want you to grab somebody's butt. Your id is like a little monster that lives inside you. That's why it's called your id. It is your it inside of your mind. And it runs on a few principles. Specifically, the most obvious one is the pleasure principle. And so it looks for immediate gratification. Eat the whole cake, punch that guy in the face, grab that butt. But your id also has a dark side. It thinks about death a lot. And so it thinks about not only your death, but the deaths of the people that you love. It thinks about aggression. And if you let it get out of control, especially, it will start to think about sort of self destructive actions, ways that you can end up hurting yourself. Now, on the other hand, the id isn't all bad. It is your id who tells you, hey, let's take a break. Hey, let's hang out with friends. Let's have fun. And your id is also what creates your life instinct, right? We call that eros, eros being the Greek god of love. Most people call him Cupid, right? But it is also your id who says, let's find a partner, let's get together, let's have sex with this person. It pushes you to be sexual. Now, the one problem is that if you let it get out of hand, then you have a libido that's out of control and you just have a lot of sexual energy and a lot of sort of sexual motivation. But if you learn to control it just right, you can use those energies to do other things. And I'll talk a little bit about that when I talk about defense mechanisms. Now, your superego specifically means above the self, okay? Ego is the self, so super above the self. And you create your superego when you are around 3 to 5. And it really sort of comes into its own right after 5, right after you've finished your Oedipus complex or your Electra complex. And you sort of develop your superego there. Um, and specifically, you develop by internalizing your parents. Now, a good way to think about your superego is that little angel. I always want to make the point that this little angel isn't always very nice. It's a little angel because it's telling you to do the right things. But the way it gets you to do the right things is by making you feel bad, by saying, hey, that's not very nice. You're kind of awful. No one likes you, or you're going to fail the test, things like that. Like your id, your superego does not understand the difference between reality and fantasy. And so, this is why if someone's superego is too strong, they become completely overwhelmed by things that, I mean, kind of don't even make sense. We all have a friend who gets like an A minus on a test, they lose their mind. That's because they're wound up too tight, you might say. And Freud would say that their superego is way too strong. And so their superego is saying, now you're never going to make it. An A minus means that you're not good enough. It means that this professor doesn't like you or whatever else it can come up with. Because it is using shame and doubt and guilt. And then, of course, the ego is the self. And your ego, you should think about it as that mediator, that referee between your id and your super ego. Um, Unlike your id and your superego, your ego does understand reality. And in fact, one of the reasons you develop your ego early on, around 2 or 3 years old, is because your brain starts to realize, oh, I can't do certain things and I have to learn to control my id. When you are one and you want a candy and mom says no, that 1 year old throws a tantrum. They don't know how to control their id, and their id wants it now, wants it now, wants it now. They have no sense of controlling it until their frontal lobe starts to control. That is, your ego starts to develop and it learns to control your id so that you don't sort of fall apart every time something doesn't go your way, because your ego is understanding now that reality is a thing that it has to deal with. Your ego is rational and organized and logical. And of course, it mediates the demands between reality and what your id wants to do. Now, your ego isn't all reason and logic. Just like the id can be good and bad, and just like the superego has its good points and bad points, your ego too has its good points and bad points. The good point is that it's logical and it tries to control the id, etc. The way that is bad is that in order to protect you emotionally, it will sometimes blur reality for you so that you think you understand what's happening, but in reality, your brain has blurred reality in a way that you don't actually understand. And if you explain your thoughts to somebody else might be able to tell you, yeah, that doesn't make any sense whatsoever. But it'll make sense to you because your ego is trying to protect you. And so it will force this blurring of reality so that you don't see yourself for who you really are. And We often call those defense mechanisms. And of course, that is exactly what I'm going to talk about next.